Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to be part of the Center for Healthy Sex in this webinar. I consider Dr. Alex Katahakis a valued clinician and colleague and friend. I don't think that Making Advances would have come to publication if it were not for her help and her personal support. So I'm just so excited to be part of this great offering that CHS does every month. In terms of what we're doing today, I've provided an overview. We're going to talk about women. Women really struggle with sex addiction, really, and some of the specifics about that. We're going to look at the issues that are underlying sexually addictive behavior for both women and for men. But we're especially going to look at differences in treating women. There are a lot of challenges, just different approaches that are best practices in treating women. So we're going to look at that as we go through our time together. We're going to look some at male partners, a very underserved population, men who are in relationship with female sex and love addicts. And we're going to talk about our culture and women and the double bind that women are in. I think, though, that first, it's important to me, at least, to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a grateful, recovering sex and love addict, and have been public about my story for years and years and years, which is my honor and my privilege to do so. These are my parents. You can see them on this screen. And I am a preacher's kid. My dad was a minister, very conservative Christian denomination. He was also a college educator and administrator, a dean most of his academic career, a gifted man, a very kind and generous man, an excellent teacher and leader and speaker and pastor, and an unrecovered sex addict. So long before Dr. Pat Carnes or anyone was thinking about sex addiction, before people were even understanding about alcoholism, my parents were struggling with this issue in their relationship, which obviously shaped completely my own life. I'm the youngest of three. I have two older brothers, and I was the very much wanted little girl. But tragedy came into our home pretty quickly, and that was the death of my mother when I was 3 years old. In some ways, I believe that her death from colon cancer was welcome to her, because it must have been extraordinarily difficult to be the wife of a very charismatic, very widely known public figure, and to know that there was a struggle with sex addiction. But obviously that hugely impacted my own attachment and a core wound that I carry to this day. I also was sexually abused. Beginning at age 5, which is this picture. It was a dear family friend. It was a college student who came and lived in our home. We had hundreds and hundreds of male students who lived in our home, and he was one. And he took me under his wing and became a father figure for me. He taught me to ride a bicycle and roller skate and was very kind and loving and nurturing for me. And he was also sexual with me. I didn't understand that was sexual abuse. I was around 10 when the grooming activities and looking at pornography and different things escalated to the point I could identify this as something around sex. I was not quite 16 when we had intercourse. That was my only real definition of sex. And by that point, I was already grown. Meaning I was a parentified child. I was running my father's household. I was his hostess for college events, for church events. And I thought I was choosing to be sexual with a man who was 15 years older than I and who had begun grooming me when I was 5. I had no understanding about that. Ultimately, I became very promiscuous. I wanted to replicate what it was like to be with him. He got married and moved away, though he came back often to visit in our home. And that wasn't about sex. It was about I wanted someone to spend time with me and to tell me that I was valuable and worthy and really an awesome person. And I found on this good Christian campus, there were tons of guys who were real willing to tell me how fabulous I was if I just have sex with them. And looking back, I was very willing to have sex with them if they would just tell me I was okay. So probably by the time, in retrospect, I was 18 or so years old, I would say I was a full-blown love, sex, relationship addict. But I had no understanding about that in my story. As a preacher's kid, I thought I am a whore. That was my self-identity. That's how I viewed myself. That I also masked with looking perfect on the outside and straight A's and excelling at all kinds of stuff. I thought that if I got married, it would take care of this promiscuity problem. And I married very early. My husband and I were 20 years old. I don't recommend that. And we really didn't have any skills for a relationship. He was a good guy, really a kind guy. And I think in retrospect, again, he so worshiped the ground I walked on, and that felt like love. Without tools for relationship, I expected him to fill the black hole inside, and I didn't understand that no one else could do that for me. And our relationship was in trouble pretty quickly. Ultimately, I had an affair, and then another affair, and another affair. And finally, after about 4 years, we divorced. We did not have any children together, for which I am grateful. And I thought somehow I'll pick up the pieces and go on with my life. And I did. Within 9 months, I had met and married David. David's my current husband. We will have been married 37 years and a few weeks. And so I'm so grateful for him. David is another very good man and a kind man, a man who was also wounded differently than I, but had been married before. And without any official diagnosis, but just hearing that story, I would suspect that she was also a female sex and love addict, and he was waiting for the right woman, and bless his heart, he got me. It was the easiest and calmest and happiest period probably of my life until I entered recovery. We do life together really well. We're very compatible. We had 2 precious little children, and something that we had both always wanted. And I really thought that life was fine until a whole series of stresses came into my life and then into our relationship, and I reverted again to acting out. I acted out for the next several years with these 2 little children at home, finally settled in this very intense relationship with a man who was next door, and my life became so unmanageable. What got my attention was cervical cancer caused by HPV. And that was in 1990. I had multiple surgeries for that. I'm completely fine. It's very curable when caught early, and mine was, but lots of complications. But my life completely fell apart until a strong suicidal ideation. I was really considering taking my own life. And for once I asked for help and called a good friend, and she came. And she told me about a young working with a counselor that she thought could help. And turned out that woman here in Nashville, Tennessee, was one of maybe 24 people in the country at that point who had trained with this young researcher named Dr. Patrick Carnes. So she knew immediately a construct of how to help me. And that began a journey of healing. Ultimately, I left my career as a journalist and went to school and got master's degrees and certifications and things to begin working in the field. So I'm so grateful for that. Ultimately, my husband chose to enter some of his own recovery, and I'm very grateful for that as well, and to be where we are at this stage. Began Bethesda workshops as part of that early in 1997, and so here we are in our 21st year. And I'm just honored and thankful for how the God of my understanding and my Christian belief system has redeemed so much pain in my life. So that's a little about me. It's important to me in terms of both integrity and then just so people know who I am. And I illustrate different things sometimes with points from my own history. And so as I'm sharing with you today, this idea, though, that women might be struggling from sex addiction, I truly thought I was the only one. And even today, 21 years into working with primarily female sex addicts, though Bethesda Workshops now works with all populations struggling with sex addiction. But after 21 years of working with women, I still hear more than anything else that cry of my heart. I'm the only one. Surely no other woman is struggling like this. And the truth is there are many, many, many women that are struggling like this. I think in my lifetime, We don't have great statistics, but I really think anecdotally that we'll find, like alcoholism, about as many women are struggling with sex addiction as men. And I think that ultimately some of the research will bear that out. When we think about this term called sex addiction, part of the research for Making Advances, the textbook that I was privileged to edit, Dr. Katahakis and a group, there were 10 of us, of women, professional women, clinicians who treated women were privileged to write. And the Women's Sexuality Survey, a little less than 500 women, not too far off from about half and half, are identifying themselves as addicts or not as addicts. And it's interesting, more women find that they're comfortable with the term, I'm a sex and love addict. So that's where the female sex love addict comes from, FSLA, than the term sex addict. And I think that's just, this term sex addict is a hard one, and it's especially a hard one for women. What I find and would encourage those of you who are working with women is to think about this term, whether we call it FSLA, female sex and love addiction. I think that's most helpful. It's really an umbrella term that covers a whole variety of presentations. And so when we look at what that is, think about the term substance abuser or even alcoholism. We don't really distinguish, well, I'm a beer person, this old gruff person, I'm a Jack Daniels person, or I always kind of thought, well, I'm a champagne person. That sounded, Southern and cute and, lovely somehow. We use the term alcoholics, and I think that's what's most helpful in conceptualizing this big picture. Not all of my colleagues agree, and they say, well, there's a real difference in love addiction, sex addiction, or pornography, something that's not crossing the flesh line, something that is. Sure, there are some nuances of treatment, but in that biggest picture, I believe that the dynamics are the same. So we're talking about standard presentations around sex addiction, the relationship addiction. That's what I would say was more relationship and romance, my primary form, though again, I certainly was very much into the sexual part as well. Today, pornography, cybersex, sexting is so much a part of women's culture. It's a part of the culture in general today, including women, especially the younger women. What we really find is that sex addiction today does not look very different in women than it does in men. There are some stereotypical, we would call them sex addict things of becoming sexual with people you've just met, that type of thing, perhaps buying or selling sex. Women also partner with another addict. So the presentations of sexual addiction are pretty much what we would see in men. And the consequences as well are very similar, whether it's employment, whether it's financial, whether it's the depression and anxiety, the spiritual shame that people feel. I work within the Christian community, and so we deal with that spiritual component a good bit here at Bethesda Workshops. But women also have some unique consequences. Certainly men get sexually transmitted infections, but they're usually more symptomatic. And for a woman, she often can be struggling with some type of infection issue, and she's not aware. So putting her health more at risk, I think, just because of the asymptomatic nature sometimes of infections in women. Obviously, unplanned pregnancy, again, it takes a man as well who's a part of that, but it is the woman who is carrying this child and having to make those very difficult decisions. What is she going to do if she becomes pregnant and has not intended on that? Just the impact on marriages, the impact on children. Some of those things are more unique in flavor to women's experience. I think in terms of diagnosing sex addiction in women, that it's helpful for the clinicians who are looking at this webinar, participating now live today, to kind of have it be red flags first. If someone's presenting with substance abuse issues or eating disorders, PTSD, depression, anxiety, to recognize, let me be sure and ask about a woman's sexual behavior. Personally, I think that standard questions around certainly pornography use and also around sexual behavior just in general should be part of every intake for every person. The same way we'll tell us about your alcohol, your substance use. Do you smoke? We ask those questions. It should just be a norm, almost assuming that individuals are engaging in these behaviors, which then gives you kind of a baseline that you can begin to talk about, are these causing any difficulties in your life? We'll talk about taking a real comprehensive history in a different way in a few minutes, but that's certainly part of diagnosing a woman. Does she have sex or love addiction? But I also think it's helpful, now coming a little bit more uniquely to women, ask the right questions. If you ask your average guy, do you ever have anonymous sex? If that's true for him, whether it's in parks or bookstores, or whether it's same sex, whether it's opposite sex, he often will say yes, if that's true for him. A woman rarely will say that. She just doesn't think about that as having anonymous sex. But if you ask the question, are you ever sexual with someone you've just met? Say you're at bars or a club or a party or something. Are you ever sexual then with someone you have just met? That kind of language will resonate with her more. And then I also think that it's helpful to not push this label with women. Again, it's a hard label to assume, a hard one to wear. It feels very pejorative. It feels very shaming. So for the clinicians, again, you might have this construct of, is she struggling, and that this is what it is. And don't push her to accept the label. She doesn't have to do that to begin to heal. We're not going to talk here about the standard things of what makes an addiction an addiction. Those would be the same for women. Continuing despite negative consequences, compulsion, tolerance, those kinds of things. But certainly it's important in diagnosing to use some of the SAST, the Sexual Addiction Screening Test, if you're trained in it in terms of that you're a CSAT and are trained in using the SDI to help in diagnosis. Those things are helpful as well. And we're not really going to focus on that particularly here in our time together today because it's so limited. I do want us to look, though, at what are some of the roots, what are some of these core issues that women are struggling with. And by the way, these are the same for men. So this is one aspect of this presentation that is going to be accurate across the board. Very often what we find is that those who wind up struggling at some level along the continuum of sexually addictive or problematic behavior, they're coming from unhealthy family systems where there are rules about how you do things. Typically those rules are things like don't talk, don't feel, deny, minimize, blame, those kinds of things. Maybe people are pigeonholed in a certain role. This person is the hero or the heroine. This one is the doer. This one is the scapegoat. This one is the lost child. Those family systems kind of roles that people get put in. Boundary issues, whether there's enmeshment in the family, that people have not had an opportunity to differentiate enough, whether there's great disengagement, whether boundaries are too loose or too rigid. Those are some core components for individuals who struggle with problematic sexual behavior. But then also there are issues of overt abuse, physical, verbal or emotional, sexual abuse, as I've shared and experienced in my story. But what is even, I think, more impactful, I am a sexual trauma survivor for 15 years, but what I know for me and what I see in the individuals that we treat at Bethesda workshops, whether they're male or female, these issues around abandonment, of not getting their needs met, not having what people need in terms of that support emotionally, maybe even physically, maybe in terms of being taught about healthy sexuality. Another word for that is attachment, is looking at, and obviously Dr. Katahakis has written this marvelous textbook about looking at some of the neuroaffective aspects of sexual addiction and marvelous material about attachment. That's another word for what has been called before attachment was a more well-known and popular theory to describe those kinds of woundings. Those are core. They are absolutely at the deepest hole in the soul about what has shaped individuals. And so people who have been wounded in this way come to have some core beliefs. They're false, but they believe them deeply. I certainly did. Things like, I am a terrible person. No one could possibly love me. If you knew me, you'd go running from the room. No one is going to meet my needs. That's so core for me and for many of the women that we work with. And then I believe that sex or a relationship is my most important need. That's going to be the key to somehow making me feel okay with me, making me feel whole. Within the Christian framework, again, which is my wheelhouse and where I operate most, it will affect one's spiritual beliefs that God isn't good enough or doesn't care enough about me to meet my needs. And so when you're looking at this whole picture, it is clear that this label, sex addiction, whether you call it sex addiction, love addiction, sex and love addiction, is really not accurate, that this is really an attachment-based intimacy disorder. We talk about that a lot in Making Advances, the textbook. Dr. Katahakis talks about that in her textbook, that this is at the core of what is happening. I actually believe that even for those, generally speaking, it's the younger women who are getting snared in the sexual culture and the pornography and those kinds of things, and it's becoming addictive for them, that they as well are still at some level. Maybe they're not overt physical or sexual abuse survivors, but I think in our culture, we don't do good attachment-based parenting or attachment-based relationships. And there's still the culture that can be wounding and that's creating this attachment-based intimacy disorder. I think that's a core, absolute core to this issue. But what's also true then is that if we're looking at, and our primary focus on today will be now, what are best practices in treating women? Here's a very, very brief cursory overview about some of the things that may be going on with women who are female sex and love addicts. But when we look at treating them, that effective therapy then, effective help for women, also for men, it's also attachment-based. And in many ways, good therapy is actually healthy re-parenting. It is coming alongside as a co-regulator, as a safe attachment figure. And so this is core. Again, though, these are things that are pretty standard for both men and for women, but we know that women are different. Like, women's bodies are different. Yes. Their neurohormones are different. Their cycle is different. Just their brains are different. Women are made and wired differently than men. But women's experience in therapy is also different. And treating women effectively is different than treating men. So let's look some about what some of those differences are. The therapeutic relationship is just key. There's lots and lots of research that shows that no matter what the modality of treatment or the theoretical approach is, the thing that makes the most difference is the therapeutic relationship. That is especially crucial for women. Just that attachment-based, right brain to right brain connection is so very important. And so the therapist role is to provide safety and containment and attachment. In many ways, it's healthy mothering. I love the work of Kelly McDaniel, who talks about mother hunger and just what happens to a woman, especially. It also happens to men, but what happens to women when that primary relationship is not what it needs to be. So therapeutically, I really believe that a healthy therapist is more important than the therapist's gender. I get asked that a lot. Can men treat women? Sure. Can women treat men? Sure. There need to be healthy boundaries and all the standard things that we know about that. We'll talk about a little bit later today, probably, that generally speaking, all things being equal, I think women benefit from gender-specific treatment in the beginning of their healing journey. In terms of with a therapist, it doesn't matter if the woman is heterosexual or lesbian, that the orientation is not significant in this regard, that women heal best in the company of other women, to have some gender-specific treatment settings, whether it's groups, whether it's intensives, if it's inpatient or residential, if that's needed. But what's most important is that the therapist be excruciatingly boundaried and have done her or his own work to be helpful. So some of those real specifics, to pay a lot of attention about the therapeutic space. Be careful about the music that you play. That can be very triggering for women especially, to have that be very muted and in the background and kind of non-recognizable music. The therapist herself or himself, we need to be careful about how we're presenting ourselves. What we're wearing, are we being appropriate? And part of it is maybe my generation, but I also think there's therapeutic importance of being on, for lack of a better word, the more conservative side of dress, so that we are not triggering unintentionally those who are working with us around such painful and deep issues like sexuality. Just our energy. Are we safe? Do we come across as needy somehow? And we're going to feel good when we're able to help our own clients heal. That's obviously not a healthy dynamic in that. We need to be very careful about therapeutic touch and be certain that if we use therapeutic touch, that that's very safe, that that's appropriate, and not something that could be misconstrued. And so just again, the knowledge and training is really, really important, and personal health. In terms of treating women, some further things, women typically require a slower pace in their work. I am a certified sex addiction therapist, that CSAT designation through ITAP, International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. And so presumably some of the clinicians who are in part of this webinar are, I hope so. It's a marvelous, marvelous training program, the gold standard in the field. But there's what's called the 30 task model that's been developed and can be very helpful, just kind of codify people's recovery and give them specific tasks to do at different times. And it's not necessarily linear. You start number 1 and go all the way through number 30. But what we find is that women do not respond nearly as well to the task approach, especially not in the beginning. They need more of that attunement, of that relationship. And if they're going to use a task, to have it be done with the therapist in the therapist's office, and to begin much more slowly in doing this work. Typically men are like, great, give me stuff to do, let me check it off my list, that's helpful for me. And very often that's not for women. Women often need attachment work, trauma work, before they're able to get sober and stay sober. And I'm glad to see in general our treatment field is leaning more in this direction anyway. It was certainly true in my own healing work. I spent a hellacious year trying to get sober and stay sober, doing great work in therapy in terms of all of the trauma and the sexual abuse and my mother's death and all of that, but not willing to give up this affair partner. And I'm very grateful that 30 years ago, that there was a therapist who was willing to do that instead of follow the typical model, at least certainly at that point that was used for substance abuse, that said, okay, you got to get sober and then you can deal with your stuff. Very often women have to do that attachment work and the trauma work before they will be willing to go to a group, to trust to let other people into their stories, and to get the support system that they may need to endure withdrawal and to achieve sobriety. So to look at all of these core areas in terms of the best practice for treating women. I think it's important, this is true for women and men both, to look at healing. This is a dual track that, yes, you have to arrest the behavior to achieve sobriety, to deal with the collateral damage, but also to be looking at these core underlying issues. And so this is what I mean by kind of both and at different points, one may take precedence over the other. But very often, again, for women, those core issues of attachment and abandonment or abuse are going to be the driving factor in the very beginning. In some ways, treatment for women is the same nuts and bolts that treatment is for men. Women really benefit from actually telling their story. I think men do too, but to actually tell the story. Here at Bethesda Workshops and many other programs, we use Marilyn Murray's trauma egg exercise, which is a great way. Here, the women who are with us right now this week, as I'm stepping out to do this webinar with CHS, spent all day long yesterday in their small groups telling their story using the trauma egg exercise. It's a powerful tool, but women need to tell the story and tell the story and tell the story. There's something about that fair witness, Pat Carnes calls it, of being heard in that pain. Obviously, at some point, women have to achieve sobriety, again, as men do, to endure the withdrawal that is part of that. That looks different for different people. That's true for men or for women. Some people talk about, I was so edgy, I felt like I'm jumping out of my skin. My bones ached, my stomach was upset, I couldn't sleep, or I was sleeping too much, or affected my eating, or just all kinds of withdrawal symptoms. There is absolutely withdrawal that many people experience from sexually addictive behavior. And to be able to ride that out, which is best done in community, and even just in recognizing this too will pass. There's some physiological information about that generally speaking, if you'll ride out that craving for around 20 minutes, it will go away. And so to just have somebody with you in that kind of process. Women obviously need to establish boundaries to go through some of the other tasks, including the task model of recovery. Women need community and they need support. Women need to build that core self. Some of the questions that came in before we started the webinar were in different ways asking about that. How do you help a woman just figure out who she is outside of being with a romantic partner? Or how do you help her know and be okay with being herself? That's a core part of recovery for everyone. And a woman can do that first with sobriety, but especially with community, with working on that trauma. All of those kinds of things are what are necessary to build that core self. And I would posit that a woman is not going to know who she is absent a relationship until she's, wait for it, absent a relationship. There's no substitute for a pretty extended period, not of just sexual abstinence, but of not being in relationship. If she's already partnered, whether married or another significant relationship, I'm not saying she needs to leave that one, but to have her core focus be on her own healing and kind of say, and have an agreement, which we'll take usually with a couples counselor, I need to put this relationship work on hold a little bit while I am working on myself. And I'm going to be sober while I do that, but I have to develop this core self to be able to bring back into this relationship, to work on her spirituality, to work on healthy sexuality. That's beyond what we're talking about here, but in terms of resources, the Center for Healthy Sex is about as good as it gets in terms of great resources around healthy sexuality, including Alex's new book and her new model, beginning with her book, Mirror of Intimacy, I think is a great place to help women who are trying to figure out what is healthy sexuality at all? How do I get in touch with myself? And I think it's also helpful to help addicts, including women, understand there's a real difference between addictive sexuality and healthy sexuality. These are not going to feel the same. And so sometimes women will say, well, you know, I guess I've always been attracted to the bad boys and had this heavy sex with them, but now that I'm sober and I've been dating some good guys and the sex with them isn't the same. So what am I supposed to do about that? Well, part of that might just be coming to understand that there's a difference in healthy sexuality that is non-addictive. I'm not saying it's worse, it's just different within that deep communion of a partnered and intimate relationship. It is amazing, but it is going to be different, and to help her understand about that. But what is also different is just this process of recovery, often for women is harder, that the shame is so great. That's lessening, I would hope, a little bit as we have some more women coming out publicly with their stories of sex, love, and relationship addiction. But I think in general, out in the culture, there's still greater shame for women. Women have some practical difficulties just in terms of self-care. The picture is changing, but often still women are the primary ones who are juggling working and the primary caregivers for young children and running households. And so it's just harder often for women to prioritize their own self-care and their own healing. Disclosure is a key piece in working with women. And again, time is not going to permit us to talk about this much in this webinar. There are great materials out there around disclosure, and they are applicable for women equally as they are for men. But what is often different is to be certain to look at the possibility for domestic violence, for interpersonal violence in this relationship. Because potentially a woman could be putting herself at risk in terms of disclosure if there are already those signs in the relationship. And so a therapist has to very carefully assess those kinds of things that may be part of this. I want us to look a little about the cycle of addiction, and especially rituals in women, to pull some of that out. Those participating in the webinar are presumably very familiar with this standard cycle of addiction. This is the simple version developed by Dr. Patrick Carnes. We've talked about the wounds that are the driving force, the shame. We're going to look some at triggers and at rituals. Triggers are what they sound like. They're not necessarily different for women than they are for men, though I often find that women are emotionally triggered a lot. Here's that song, or here's some kind of emotion that they find highly, highly triggering. And when that happens, then there's a progression that is part of this cycle of addiction. And that very often the trigger is going to lead into preoccupation, and it's almost just automatic to be thinking or fantasizing about either how can I stop this pain that I'm in, or how can I feel good just for the sake of feeling good. And so important in working with addiction, and I find it's subtle in working with women, is to break down this cycle of looking at how do I go from being triggered and into my preoccupation, how do I go to acting out? What is this process? Because for women, these rituals, or what we're talking about, are often much more subtle. And so you start with, and this works with men, but you start with the acting out. So what was the acting out in this case? And you ask her, what happened before? And what happened before that? And what happened before that? You are backing up this cycle to help her identify that her rituals may be everyday, what seemingly are non-problematic behaviors for other women, but for her, they are quite problematic. And here are some of them. Women have all kinds of clothing and grooming and makeup rituals. You know, they know when I wear these shoes, when I wear this lingerie, when I put on this kind of makeup or perfume, I used to think that, I'm a good Southern sweet girl, and that some of all this touchy-feely, kind of batting my eyes, smiling, patting on men I was just a friendly person, and came to understand in my recovery work and step work that no, those were actually part of the sending out feelers, sending out rain checks, part of the rituals that would connect me with someone. And so to have her look very, very specifically at those kinds of rituals, to have her be able to identify when I'm doing this is a problem. And therefore, ultimately, to be setting boundaries around that. For me, a real ritual was going to lunch with a man, and then especially having drinks. I grew up in a no alcohol home, so that was really kind of risque, for me 30 years ago, and didn't realize how being in that setting was a huge boost here, and the ritualistic connection of someone, and was important for me to understand about that. So I would encourage women themselves who are watching the webinar, or the clinicians who are working with them, get very, very specific about these rituals. It's really important for every form of their acting out. The rituals may be super short, whether it's around acting out just with pornography or something online, just in terms of getting an internet connection and enough privacy to do that. But some of them are much more complicated and involved. As we think further about treating women, I want us to look at group therapy. It's the treatment of choice for addiction for women as well as for men, just across the genders. But I think it's so especially helpful for women, and it's also extremely challenging for women. There's a vast difference in doing groups with women than there is with men. We do both kinds here at Bethesda Workshops. We treat male sex addicts, we treat female sex addicts, and we treat female partners, largely female partners. We have some male partners who come. But women, whether they are addicts or partners, those groups are different. And there's some reasons about that. Female sex addicts, particularly though, since that's our focus for today, have some real challenges in being with other women. We compare ourselves to other women. We look at women as the competition for men, for sure. We look at women as adversaries. We get catty with each other. Your claws are showing. Or maybe on the opposite side, we look at women as our complete mother figures that we've always wanted, that we have been hungry for, and we attach ourselves, and very codependent. I know that's not a popular word, but it works for me. Very enmeshed, unhealthy relationships that become problems. And so when you get women in a group, women are bringing all of their stuff into the group. I think I really love the chapter in Making Advances about group therapy that's really unpacking this a lot, that I think can be very helpful to working with groups of women, even if they're not sex and love addicts. But what women most need is community, and what is hardest for women to develop, ironically, seems to be that community. And part of these are some of those reasons about why. Some other challenges for female sex and love addicts in terms of their recovery, just the social mores and expectations. We'll look at that a little bit more in a minute. Even though more women are coming forward, there's still not nearly the number of women in recovery. Maybe they're struggling at rates that aren't too much different from men, but they're not in recovery. That's true for alcoholism, substance abuse, for most of the other addictions, that not as many women as men seek recovery. That's certainly true around sex and love addiction. There's not as much help that's targeted for women. Again, that's changing as more people are writing books and are telling their stories. But it's just hard for a woman to find other women in her support groups, in her 12-step groups, other women for sponsors. And then some women are double winners. They're called in recovery circles. Maybe they're sex addicts themselves, but they also tend to gravitate and partner with a sex addict. And that is a particularly toxic and chaotic and very difficult kind of situation for them. I want us to talk just a little bit about the male partners. So we're gonna look for the now at the heterosexual population of females who struggle with sex and love addiction and the male partners that they're associated with. I'm pleased and thrilled that our field of treatment has come light years in the last, I don't know, decade, and working with partners and coming to recognize their unbelievable betrayal trauma, their need for their own help and their own resources and all of those kinds of things. Male partners, though, are unrecognized, very much underserved. There have to be tons of them out there, but I would guarantee you that my husband David felt like he was certainly the only one. And it's particularly true. There's so much cultural shame about that. I mean, it's one thing for a female to be connected with a male sex addict, and unfortunately, she sometimes gets blamed. Well, if she'd have more sex with him or whatever, then he wouldn't be in these difficulties. But when it's reversed and there is a male partner of a female sex addict, he never, ever gets blamed. Now, I'm not saying that either partner should get blamed, because that's not how this works. So please don't hear that. But what I am saying is that culturally, we look at that guy and we have names for him, like you've been cuckolded, and what is it about you and about your manhood that you can't keep your woman at home? And that's very painful and very difficult for the male partners of female sex addicts. This is not a research statement at all. It's purely anecdotal from what we have seen. And we've worked with male partners around here at Bethesda Workshops for probably 15 years or so. And I find in terms of big categories, there are three. Very often male partners are extremely angry. Now, female partners are too. And again, please hear me and don't misunderstand. They have every single right to be angry. This is a horrible betrayal. But I often find that male partners who are in this very angry mode, they feel different to me. They feel dangerous. We hear with great regularity, alarming regularity, from a female sex addict that her male partner is furious with her, and he's so angry and he's threatening every single day to leave her, but then he wakes her up from a dead sleep at midnight at 2 o'clock in the morning and demands and has angry sex with her. That's a different level of just the rage that they experience because of the betrayal. On the other hand, we find that male partners can be very passive. My husband David would freely say that was his coping mechanism. And so they are perhaps more likely to tolerate intolerable behavior without setting boundaries that are protective for them, and ultimately perhaps are helpful to kind of increase the female sex addict's pain enough that she might be willing to get help. And then male partners often we find are also addicted, maybe not necessarily to sex, though some of them are, but to substances, to other kinds of behaviors. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there are special implications for disclosure that really need to be very carefully looked at. And finally, as we're getting toward the end of the presentation and I'll begin to entertain some questions, I think that women today are in an incredibly difficult cultural bind. That on the one hand, and this has been historical, that the culture says, real women are supposed to be attractive and sexy, and that's a woman's greatest asset, and to flaunt it. And we see that in how women present themselves and how they dress and just how they carry themselves. But what we also now see in terms of the very positive, I think, impact of the MeToo movement in our culture is that women have incredible power beyond their sexuality and deserve to be treated as something other than as sex objects. But when you combine these two, they are colliding. And please do not misunderstand this statement. I'm never saying that a woman deserves to be exploited, or certainly not abused sexually in any way because of how she appears, because of how she dresses, because of how she acts. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, and this may be very unpopular, and that's okay, we'll have, I'd love to start a bigger conversation, is that when women treat themselves as sex objects, which is what our culture teaches us to do, then at the same time, now we're looking at how that is so demeaning and so difficult when people in power, primarily men, are treating women as sex objects. These are two competing kinds of ideas that are difficult, that I think women and then I think our culture are going to have to come to terms on. So just throwing that out there as part of the conversation that may blow this up. We'll see. I hope not. Again, if you'd kindly let me remind you of just some helpful resources of books about women's sex addiction, and then tell you about Bethesda workshops. We're in Nashville, Tennessee. Our program comes from all across the country. There's plenty of information on our website. We've been treating women, as far as I know, we were the first gender-specific treatment for women of any kind. And so I'm honored to be a part of that. I'm going to see if I can, in technology, get out of this screen and back to the Zoom and open a chat window and a Q&A window and see what is the questions that are up here. People are asking, would people be able to get the slides? Yes, they'll be part of the webinar that's on the YouTube channel from Center for Healthy Sex. So all of that will be available for you. Someone had asked before about marketing. How do we market to women? How do we, as a clinician, tell women about the resources that you have available in your practice? I think actually Center for Healthy Sex does a super job of doing that. I've kind of taken the right straight on approach in terms of healing for women. That's not scary, but then the subtitle for that program is Female Sex, Love, and Relationship Addicts, and that gets a little scarier of just putting it out there. But I think marketing for women is not particularly different than marketing any type of sex addiction or healthy sexuality resource to network, to connect with others. I think that the word of mouth with women is really helpful. Doing groups for women as they're connecting and really benefiting can be helpful. And sometimes in some of that marketing language, you need to soften it a little bit, talking about challenges in healthy sexuality and relationships, and avoid the words like addiction to help them feel free enough to walk through the door. I have been so honored to be with you today, and I'm grateful for this opportunity and to Center for Healthy Sex. I would love to be helpful to you in terms of programs, and you can find more information on Bethesda Workshops, Bethesda Workshops, that's plural with an S.org, O-R-G, and would love to be helpful. A question is coming up, suggestions for dealing with female partners of sex addicts and how to approach the subject of their own addiction. I think it's a wonderful question. That would be another webinar in helping partners of sex addicts. There are many similarities about that, as well as some pretty core differences. So thank you so much for being here and for being a part of the webinar, and I wish you all the best. Take care. Bye-bye.